Let me bring in Craig Alexander. He is Vice President of Economic Analysis at the CD Howe Institute. And before that, Craig was Chief Economist with TD Bank and has been part of the pre-budget consultations with finance ministers before. Craig, welcome back to you.
It's a pleasure, Carol.
Should we be spending money we don't have?
Well, when the economy is experiencing very slow economic growth, there is a rationale for government to step up and try and help the economy. What we're seeing at the moment is the economy in Canada going through a very painful adjustment to the commodity shock that has led to certain regions of the country ending up in recession, such as Alberta and Newfoundland. And when you have a pace of growth that's projected to only be about 1.4% this year, and that's what the government outlined today, that would suggest that there is scope for additional stimulus. Now, the Bank of Canada is already providing a lot of stimulus by keeping interest rates low. So then the question is, should the federal government be stepping up and providing some support to the economy, give it a bit of a boost to help it weather the slow economic times? And so I think that the message we're getting from the government today is, yes, the finances aren't in as good shape as they expected because growth is very weak. Revenues aren't going to be as strong. But at the same time, they are going to proceed with doing their investments in infrastructure and key priorities to try and help the transition of the Canadian economy.
There's a risk in that. They have to borrow in order to meet those expectations. Where is the risk in that?
So, from my point of view, even though the government's announced today that without any of their spending and investment programs, the deficit's already going to be close to $18.4 billion. That means that with the measures in the upcoming budget for 2016, the deficit could be $30 billion. That doesn't actually worry me that much. As a share of the economy, it's still quite low. But what it really does do is it raises the question that if the government provides support and does deficit spending over the next few years, is it going to have the resolve to balance the books farther down the road? So it isn't that they're running a deficit now that's the real contentious issue. The issue is going to be, can they actually balance in the future?
Yeah, the burden that we would leave for the next generation potentially.
Well, and the argument in favor of doing the stimulus now is the level of debt at the federal government level is quite low. Interest rates are incredibly low, so the cost for the government of Canada to borrow is quite cheap compared to what it was in the 90s. So, if you're going to do some deficit spending, now isn't a bad time to do it. But as I said, when you run a deficit, you do add to the debt burden, and ultimately you can't run deficits indefinitely. You actually have to balance the books. That's sound fiscal policy. And that's something that last time around the Liberals in the 90s were capable of doing. But also understand that in the 90s, it became a crisis. And it was because of being pushed by a crisis that they balanced the books. The question is going to be, without a crisis, when we get a couple of years down the road, are they going to actually be able to restrain spending, or are they going to start raising taxes? And this is something that, for example, businesses will worry about, but also personal taxes could rise during an environment where they're trying to restrain the deficit. So it's very easy to do deficit spending. It's very easy to find new things to spend money on that are public priorities. What's really hard to do if you run deficits is then balance the books. And I think that this was one of the big challenges the last government had. They ran a very big deficit in 2009, and then they spent years trying to balance the books, and it was very difficult. And I think the Liberals are setting themselves up for a similar experience where they can invest in the economy now and deficit spend now, and certainly they were elected with that commitment. But ultimately, sound finances means they got to balance.
Okay. For those of us who aren't economists, explain exactly how it should work if all goes according to plan.
Well, in a perfect world, what happens is the government will inject money into the economy through things like infrastructure spending and helping displaced workers, expanding, say, EI benefits or length of time you get benefits to help workers through a difficult time. And the idea is to provide support, help the economy to grow during a period where the private sector isn't growing strongly. And then once the economy gets going again, once you get stronger growth down the road, then the government can start to rebalance, because as the economy grows, the tax revenues improve, and this makes it easy to rebalance. In practice, that's actually very difficult. And quite frankly, when you look at the global economy, one of the big arguments that economists are currently debating is an issue around, are we stuck in a slow growth world for a long period of time? And if that's the case, then it's going to be much harder for the government to balance its books down the road. The other factor that's out there that's going to make it really challenging for the government is the fact that the Canadian population is aging. And as baby boomers exit the labor force, the trend pace of growth in the Canadian economy is going to slow, and that means weaker revenue growth as well for the government. So demographics are actually going to make it harder to balance the books down the road. So the idea is basically stimulate now, and then when the economy is doing better, let tax revenues reduce the deficit. But in practice, this could actually be quite difficult.
Isn't there a way that the government could induce the private sector to spend the money or to borrow the money to take the chance to increase the growth of our economy?
Well, in a sense, that's how the Bank of Canada's monetary policy works. So by lowering interest rates, it makes it cheaper for individuals and for businesses to borrow. And the idea then is that even in difficult times, people will be more inclined to borrow and spend, and that helps the economy. So monetary policy is certainly geared towards getting the private sector to do more of the lifting. In terms of fiscal policy, you know, if governments do things like cutting taxes and things like that, that can help stimulate private sector growth. But I think we're in a world today where there's recognition that the private sector really is probably going to be reluctant to really generate a lot of growth. So, for example, the government can't offset the impact of the fall in oil prices. There is no question that capital spending in the energy sector is going to fall over the next couple of years. So as a consequence, there's little point in trying to make it more attractive for the energy sector to invest. What you really need to do is find things that the government can spend on that will help boost the economy. And amongst the things they can do, infrastructure actually is the one that gives you the biggest payoff to the economy when the money is spent. The problem the government has on infrastructure is that many projects aren't shovel ready, and it can take a long time for them to get up and running. And that means that infrastructure, while it's the biggest boost to the economy, it actually, from a point of view of deploying the money, it actually takes time. And right now, the government's got a very difficult balancing act. What I hear when I go to Ottawa is that they want to invest in projects that will boost the long-term potential and competitiveness of the Canadian economy. So big
sustainable development,
big infrastructure.
for example.
But at the same time, they actually want to boost short-term areas like Alberta, Newfoundland, Saskatchewan that are having a lot of difficulty.
So how do they do that, Craig?
Well, there are going to be projects. So I think one of the things that's happened is I think the government has talked to the municipalities and said, okay, you cities know what your key priorities are. So tell us what are the projects that you could deploy the money very quickly and get going so that you get an immediate boost. And I think that they're looking to probably the negotiations and the discussions with cities to identify the infrastructure projects that will give short-term boost. And at the same time, I think they're looking at long-term projects like trying to reduce the congestion in some of our major cities that actually will take a long time to come to fruition. So they've got a difficult balancing act right now.
And at the end of the day, one more point to throw in there, there's a lot of pressure on the government to kind of redistribute the money already in the economy, providing for the elderly and the very young.
Well, and I think that the other segment we really should focus on is they really need to provide more support to displaced workers. Because what we had for many years during the energy boom and the resource boom was many workers went into that sector to profit from the strong economic times, the jobs, the income that was available. Well, you know what? The commodity price shock is going to be with us for years. And so as a consequence, there's going to be a lot of workers that now need to shift out of those sectors and into other sectors for gainful employment. And this isn't going to be easy. So I think that there's a very fundamental role for governments at the federal, and the provincial level to provide support to the displaced workers. And at the same time, there's a lot of workers in Canada that face barriers. You look at the high unemployment rate of youths. You look at the poor labor market outcomes of Aboriginals.
Yeah.
You look at challenges facing Canadian immigrants. There's a lot of Canadians that are facing barriers to success. And I think that governments can do a lot to improve things on that front as well.
All right, lots of storm clouds ahead. Craig Alexander, Vice President of Economic Analysis at the CD Howe Institute. Craig, thank you so much.
Thanks, Carol.
Okay.